You're listening to Represent, the queermusicals.com podcast. Hello and welcome to Represent, the queermusicals.com podcast. My name's James Lovelock and my guests today are Elander and Terique Jarrett. And we're going to be talking about all things to do with representation in theatre, perhaps in other mediums as well. But I'm going to get Elander and Terique to introduce themselves first. So Elander, do you want to say a little bit about what you do and some of the things that you've been in?
Hey, my name is Elander. I'm an actor, and recently I was in a production of The Normal Heart at the National Theatre, and I played the character of Craig Donner. I also, before that, was in a play called Barbershop Chronicles, where I played a character called Ethan, and some other musicals and plays as well.
Terique?
Hi everyone, I'm Terique Jarrett. I'm also an actor. Recently I was in a production of Daddy, a melodrama at the Almeida Theatre. I played a character called Franklin. And before that, I just finished a run of Hilary Mantel's The Mirror and the Light.
Excellent. Now, I should say this is the first time that I have recorded this podcast in a posh studio. And that is the third time that we've done the introductions now, because I keep on pressing all of the wrong buttons. But never mind.
We live and we learn.
We do, yes. So I will do the story again that we did just now, which was about the fact that we met at Legally Blonde at the Open Air Theatre a few weeks back. So we struck up a conversation. And I don't usually just pick people up off the streets to be on my podcast, but actually, I'm really glad I did as well, because it was a really interesting production. I think it opened some quite interesting conversations. And maybe that would be a good place to start, just as it's something that I guess we've all got in common, so we can all sort of talk a little bit about. And as one of the amazing things about that particular production is the way that it was cast, and the fact that we had actors from all sorts of different backgrounds. There were trans actors, non-binary actors. And so actually, if you haven't seen the original production, it's quite interesting to kind of come into it as if like this is the norm for this sort of musical theatre.
And I think it made sense. To me, seeing this production, I was like, I presumed that it wasn't written for these. Actually, well, I knew because they made a big deal of it.
Sure.
But I was like, I know that original production was probably mostly, if not all, white production. Yeah. So seeing the way that this was cast, not even in terms of just race, but gender and in so many different ways, I was like, it just makes sense to me like this.
Absolutely.
And then, in my opinion, it brought the piece to new levels. Like that song "Chip on Your Shoulder," which Emmett sings. I'm not sure the actor's name, but I loved him. I thought he was brilliant. Black actor.
Michael Ahoma.
Yeah, he was brilliant, but the whole song was brought to a new level because of that. The context of the character was talking about kind of coming from a working class, harder background and making your way, and it kind of. So I think that can happen if people cast things in certain ways. You can elevate the work to a new level if you bring it into a new sphere. You know, new actors performing it, and I thought that Legally Blonde really did that.
It's something that you gain a lot of by changing existing roles, which were not necessarily written for the people or the kind of background of the person that's playing it now. And there's kind of one thing that, like you say, that chip on, I cannot imagine, well I can because I've seen it, but chip on my shoulder is weird when you've got a middle class white bloke singing it.
Right.
It just doesn't hit the same way. But then there's also, I guess, the argument for things to be written specifically for people who come from the background of like with Daddy, a melodrama, which was, I've got to get the right Jeremy O.Harris.
Yes.
That's it, yeah. And so that's very specifically written, like his other work as well. Did you know much about Jeremy's work before you started on Daddy?
Before starting Daddy, I didn't know much about Jeremy. When I first started auditioning for it, I followed him on Instagram and was like looking him up. And quickly realized why he was a big deal. Like a lot of my friends knew so much about him. So then, I started off with that. I think one thing about Jeremy that he's happy to lean into is that he's very controversial.
Yeah.
We had, so just to give some people who may not know a bit of context about Daddy, I always feel like I should call it Daddy, a Melodrama, because that's the full title, like just to give it its justice. In the play, it's about a young black artist. He is in a relationship with an older white man, and it's set in LA, and it's about so many things, but that's the basis of the story. One thing that Jeremy likes to do is what he calls a blackout performance. So it's where people who identify as black or black people are invited to come to this performance. It's not a thing. It's not saying if you are not black, do not come, but it is to encourage more black people into theatre, because not many black people grow up going to see the theatre. I didn't. I feel privileged to have got into the theatre industry because it wasn't accessible to me growing up. So yeah, that was even away from his material, the way that he approaches theatre, for example, the blackout performances, is controversial in that way. I think with things like that and I don't know if there was backlash, but the controversial or different casting of Legally Blonde, things like that excite me because when people get mad at things that I think are important to kind of change the space of theatre as we currently know it, I think it's exciting because it forces people to, or I would want it to force people to look at themselves or look at things how they currently are and see, oh, well, it actually works if we try things another way.
Yeah.
I think that blackout initiative is something that's really important. But I think there's also, I've noticed, particularly when I'm in the States, that what tends to happen is if the people are on the stage, if the musicals or the plays are about a certain community, then that community tends to be better represented in the audience.
Absolutely.
And I was wondering whether you'd had sort of any experiences like that where you feel like maybe you've seen yourself represented more than you would usually. I don't know.
I mean, I definitely I played Barbershop Chronicles, which is by Inua Ellams. I first saw it was at the National in the Dorfman, and it's about a group of African men in a barbershop, and the barbershop kind of gets transported from London to Africa, different parts of Africa, and it's kind of about men, and that the barbershop is kind of a space for like a therapy space almost. And when I went to see it, you come into the theatre and there's all these boys with barbershop chairs grabbing the audience, putting them in chairs, pretending to give them trims. You've got like Afro beats blasting out. And as soon as I walked in, I looked around and I've never seen so many black people in the National before. Straight away, I was just like, I'm going to love it. You can feel the vibe already. You know, people were shouting out. It was much more of a kind of open environment. And the play, I mean, it touched me so deeply to the point where I was like, I have to play that part. I was lucky enough that an audition came a bit later for the tour, and I just went in and was like, I have to do this. But we toured to a few different places. We went to the Manchester Exchange, we went to Sheffield Crucible, and we had a woman. Fuel Theatre was the production company that produced it, and they had a woman whose job it was to do audience liaison. So she made sure there were black people in the audience, doing outreach programs, all of that. And that made such a huge difference to the show because you felt your community were there. And a lot of times people came up to us and said, you know, we've walked past this theatre many times. We did not know that we could come in. We did not know this space was for us. And to come in and to see our lives and our experiences on stage, you know, it means a lot to them. I mean, there's one story we had a pupil referral unit of boys come to see the show. They'd never been to the theatre before. And the start of the show, when we're kind of getting audience participation, they were sat there with their hoods up, like, we are not getting involved. They were literally like, do not touch me. We're not getting involved. Leave us alone. And my scene kind of ends the play. And at the end of the play, I looked out and I saw one of the boys and he had his hood down and he was just streaming with tears, just crying. And it sort of, I stopped for a second and kind of forgot what I was doing because I just thought, wow, that, you know. And at the end, he came up and kind of said, I've never seen anything like this. This has changed me. Like, I thank you so much. And it's, you know, it really means something. So it's really important for production companies to spend that money on, you know, something like a blackout performance or getting that audience in because it makes a huge difference.
And it does make a difference in the sense that so Blackout was a solo performance. And then the next day, one thing that Almeida does, they do a 25 and under performance, and I think it's for free. And I think they do that with all of their shows. I might be wrong, but I think they do it with all of their shows. So back to back, we had two audiences that were completely different to the traditional Almeida audience. And I don't know what it was like on Barbershop Chronicles, but it's like when you have an audience that represents a certain group or a certain demographic, they respond to different parts differently.
So different.
They hear things differently. Yeah. And it's like, especially when you go from, 4 weeks of rehearsals, then you're a certain way in the run, all of that foundation work is there. All of the delving into the meaning behind the words and like character relationships is there. But then you get into performance, and then the audience, I always think of it as the audience kind of reminds me what we're doing. So sometimes they'll respond to something and I'm like, oh yeah, that joke's there. But hearing it with either the young audience or the black audience, they heard stuff that either I was like, see, right, you hear it too. Not everyone else hears it with the traditional Almeida audience. Or they would hear stuff that I was like, oh, I'd never gone that deep, or I'd never heard it in that way. So I think that is an interesting thing. I don't know, was it like that on Barbershop as well?
Oh my God, it was so much. I mean, you know, there's a lot of humor, and a lot of it specifically kind of African humor. And we went to, when we were in Bristol, we had a predominantly white audience, and it wasn't the same. Some people were laughing at the characters and not laughing at the content. And we kind of said, we need black people in this audience because it changes the room, it changes the piece.
It's also funny to me, there were certain things that I think Jeremy wrote to make people feel uncomfortable. And it was interesting going out into the, if I had people in, hearing their experience. So there were certain jokes or certain lines. The character, the white boyfriend of my character, Franklin, he kept calling Franklin his little Naomi. That was his pet name. And every black audience member that I had in, they found that uncomfortable.
Yeah, I did.
Right, I did as well. But like you'd hear laughs in those moments. And it was, for me, it was like, maybe these people feel awkward. So it's awkward laughter. Maybe some people just out and out find that funny. But it was interesting to me speaking to the black audience members who I had in, they were like, that line on its own was uncomfortable. Hearing someone next to me laugh out loud made me feel even more uncomfortable. So I was like, that's interesting. And I think that's what Jeremy wants.
Yeah, that is really interesting, because I noticed that sometimes as a gay person going into LGBTQ, when there's specific LGBTQ content in musicals or films or plays. That's really interesting. And it is one of the things that I think theatre has struggled with, is trying to find a way to get different audiences in. And it's great to hear that there's these initiatives that are happening. I know that there's the Black Ticket Project as well, which is another way. I mean, again, I guess it's limited to the people that are contributing to it as to how many people it can help, but it certainly helps get more people into the theatre.
I mean, in my opinion, it's just not enough, though. I mean, the reality is you have to spend the money. You know, there are these productions that are making a lot of money, and some of that money should go back into making sure that the audience, you know, if you're creating a piece that's for a certain audience, you need to do some work to get that audience in. People are not just going to... The problem in this country is we have a classist system which kind of suggests that theatre is for a certain type of people and that other people it's not for. And so you have to do that work in schools so that young people from a young age are already kind of indoctrinated into the theatre and feel like they're welcome. You have to do that from a young age. And then, you know, for other communities, I mean, the Normal Heart was similar. I had a little bit of a problem when there was incredible production that the National weren't spending enough money to get young queer people into this play, because for me it was a play that was so important for queer people. It's our history. And we had a few conversations where I kind of said we need to do that, and you know, it didn't happen as much as I wanted it to, but I think it's really, really important that those people, specifically producers, spend the money.
It's one of the things that, I mean, I used to be a secondary school teacher, and this was going back probably about 12 years now, and it's one of the things that's always been really difficult, because people don't want to talk about sexuality when they're talking about teenagers. And so they can't identify the queer teenagers because it's never something that's talked about. And it concerns me. And that's why it's so great that we've got shows now like Heartstopper that are targeting that specific age of children, really, or of teenagers. It is really interesting, this idea of getting the audience in that the play is meant for, and thinking about, and I think you're right. I think we do need to think about how the theatres, which are hopefully making a bit of money on these shows, are getting people into getting people in.
It's interesting what you just said there about not being able to identify the queer students. Because I think that with the LGBTQ plus community, it's very over-sexualized in the sense that it's like, if you're I'm sure many people have experienced this. If you're a queer teenager or child, it's like, oh, well, how do you know? Because you think of it as like, well, you're too young to be thinking about people in that way. But it's like, if you turn that on its head with a heterosexual person, you wouldn't, as a child, go to a child, go, how do you know that? You shouldn't be, you just accept it like, right, it's a given. It's like the default, like if you're not that, then it's like, how do you know that? That's this might be a phase. So yeah, that's just interesting.
I mean, that's literally the conversation that's going on in America, isn't it? There's a lot of Republicans that are saying you're over-sexualizing our children. They shouldn't be learning about trans issues. They shouldn't be learning about homosexuality at such a young age because it's radicalizing them and because it's sexualizing them. But there is a difference between, sex and love and identity. They're two different things. Teaching someone about who they are is nothing to do with sex. It's just
and I think that's the where it's been blurred to the point. Why people are like, oh no, we shouldn't be talking about this. We shouldn't be talking to children about this. Which is damaging because, in my opinion, because I think, if someone ultimately, we know who we are as people. And I think if an individual knows who they are at, 14 years old, but they're constantly told, oh no, you don't know, this is a phase, or whatever they're told, then of course it's going to shape them or shape their mind to, they're always going to be who they are. And then maybe later down the line, they'll come to terms with, for example, their sexuality. But yeah, I think it's just damaging if we're constantly telling younger people to nip that in the bud when it comes to identity.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I should think I'm probably 15 years older than you, maybe a little bit more than that. And I definitely, when I was at school, it just wasn't something that was spoken about. Right. But me being gay was not just to do with sex. I mean, it was partly to do with sex. People have, children will have a sexual awakening at some stage, but that wasn't the first thing I knew about being gay. It was, there's all sorts of other things that are part of it. And I think you're right. I think we miss that. And again, one of the things that makes Heartstopper such a good television show is that sex is not part of it. I really recommend it, but I shall not go on about it for ages and ages. But yeah, so thinking about that, can you think about when you were younger, were there certain plays, films, TV shows, actors, whatever it was that you really that I helped you to identify yourself?
I mean, for me, I grew up in a very working class background. We didn't go to the theatre really. Sure. I think I saw maybe a pantomime or something. And, mostly it was something like EastEnders. So, I mean, we would sit every night and watch EastEnders. And these kind of, soaps, which you kind of see as menial, actually allowed me a look into lots of different kinds of people. I remember there being a gay character and being like, oh, I had no idea what that was. I didn't know that was me, but I sort of learnt about it through that. So yeah, something like EastEnders, then Coronation Street and Emmerdale and all those kind of soaps were kind of mine.
For me, and I tell this story all the time, the first program that I watched that made me commit to acting was a BBC dramedy, I guess, called Hustle. The lead character in that is played by Adrian Lester, a dark-skinned black man. Yep. And to me, I was like, you can tell by the way that I talk, I'm not the stereotypical black man. And I remember growing up as a child, I was like, oh, well, I don't sound like a stereotype. I'm not going to be able to be an actor because I'm not going to be able to play a thug. I'm not going to be able to play someone who's, all of these negative or damaging stereotypes. And then seeing Adrian Lester, who was presented as a very well-spoken, he was a criminal. I will say that in this, because it's about a group of grifters. But he was presented as a well-rounded, multifaceted, colourful character. He was the lead of this thing. And I think for the most part, he wasn't playing all of these damaging stereotypes. So for me, that was the first time I'd seen a character on TV that represented me more truthfully than I'd ever seen before.
Yeah.
I loved Hustle. It's one of my favourites.
I
have
still
watched
love it
so many times. It's one of those shows where it's you kind of, I'm quite an anxious person. I mean, I have anxiety. And so I struggle watching anything where I think, oh my goodness, this could have a tragic ending. And the thing with Hustle is, it's gonna be okay.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, it definitely has a formula. And I like that. I rate that.
as I think that's one of the things that I struggle with a little bit as well, is that I find quite often as a gay person that I'm only allowed one box. So people will, my sexuality I'm very open about. It's part of what I teach, it's part of what I research. My mental health and my health in general is something that I find there's less room to talk about sometimes. And this idea of kind of having to choose your box, you can't be gay and disabled, or you can't be,
right.
Bisexual and black, or whatever it might be. And I wonder about sort of roles where you find that you can explore the intersections between different parts of identity.
I mean, for me, it was mixed race, working class, and queer. So it was lots of boxes to fill, never really knowing where I fitted in racially, sexuality wise or class wise, and always kind of feeling lost. And coming to characters and kind of being like, what is my voice? What do I have to say? And learning that actually that experience is what I need to bring. That feeling of never fitting in. A lot of the characters that I play are those kind of lost boy kind of characters. And when I understood that my experiences can go into the characters and can work, that was kind of when I kind of found my lane. But yeah, still, even now, I still feel like I don't specifically know who I am. I don't think anyone ever really does. I think you're constantly it's a journey, and you're just constantly trying to work out who you are. We get to do that on stage in front of lots of people, which some would say is crazy, but I enjoy a lot. But yeah, it's kind of the intersectionality of who you are is kind of all.
Yeah, I think for me it was Daddy playing Franklin, because before that, and this isn't a criticism, but before that, I hadn't played a character that belonged to so many different groups.
Yeah.
So I think that sometimes, and this isn't true for everyone, but sometimes it's helpful to see an example or an existing example of something or someone that represents you in some ways, all the ways, one way, before you can then commit to that identity or commit to that lifestyle or commit to that career or whatever it may be. And like I say, for me, Jeremy did a great job of writing Franklin as a black. Well, I think he's gay. We didn't go too deep into that, but he's and religious as well. Yeah. One thing that was so interesting to me in Daddy is that his Franklin's mother is a Christian woman, but like a devout Christian, and would cite Bible scriptures, But sexuality of her son was never an issue. Like, there's no indication that was ever going to be an issue. And she loves him regardless of that. So I think, having so many boxes that were ticked in that, I was like, wow, this is real. This exists,
If you're interested in LGBTQ+ representation in musical theatre, check out our website, www.queermusicals.com, for lots more information about musicals with LGBTQ+ characters. It's lovely when the idea that all these boxes as well, kind of moving away from them, the idea that the identity is fluid as well, and that actually, now here I am at what am I now, 43, and I'm very different to the person that I was when I was 23 or 28 or 33 or whatever it is. And actually some of the kind of ways I would have described myself then are different to the ways that I would describe myself now.
Course.
And so often we miss that when we're talking about even if it's something that doesn't change, like race, there still is an attitude towards race that might, or an idea of where you fit that might change. And I think even as a white person, that's something that I've learned, having come from an all-white area when I was growing up, taught at an all-white school, all these things, and then suddenly realizing there is a whole other world out there that is so important and needs to be part of, needs to be part of consideration.
Yeah. I mean, going back to musical theatre, I think that's one of the biggest problems, is that the pieces are written for mostly white people in white rooms with white creatives. So those conversations just don't come up. Yeah. And then suddenly when they're faced with the competition, they're like, oh, we didn't even think, and I guess that's a elite classes system too, because to be educated, say, in music, and to be able to play an instrument and to be able to compose and to be able to do all these things, you have to be kind of have a lot of money and be very affluent. So it's sort of changing that and getting black people, specifically I think black creatives, into a room, black composers, black choreographers, all those people into the rooms, making the decisions and creating work. It is gonna change from the top down. I think which kind of needs to happen.
I think there was a moment where I fell out of love with musicals because I think musical theatre as an industry, and it's not on its own in this, but it touts itself as being all inclusive and it's for everyone. And I think why I fell out is because I truly, truly believed that. And then when I entered the industry as a professional, I was like, well, that's not the case. Like, not everyone is included. Not everyone can get into it. So I think, and again, musical theatre is not on its own in that way, but I think why I fell out of love with it is because I truly believed that. And I think it is starting to change. It's not changing as quickly as TV, film, for example. And it's not changing as quickly as it is in America. And that's not to let America off and say that America is perfect. I can't remember what interview it was, but Sandra Oh and Kerry Washington were talking about representation behind the camera in the UK. And I think it's fair to say that they were shocked by the lack of representation that there was behind the camera. And it was interesting to me because they're two women of color. People of color. I prefer to use the term world majority. So they're two people from the world majority and living in America. I think Sandra Oh's from Canada, or grew up in Canada. To me, it was interesting because I was like, I know America's not perfect, but the fact that they're saying that it's so far ahead, and it makes sense because I hear a lot of British talent, not just actors, but a lot of British talent going over. They get a certain way in their career, and they talk about there being a ceiling for them, whether that's due to their race or their gender or their place on the social strata, and then they go over to America and then they find more opportunities over there. So that made sense to me when they were saying that.
It's bizarre as well, isn't it? That it's taking such a long time for these things to change. And I think you're right, particularly in the UK. Yeah. I mean, I think the UK sometimes is a little bit further ahead on some things to do with LGBTQ representation, which is, again, what I've been researching the last few years. But it does... One of the things that's really noticeable, just looking at musicals with LGBTQ characters, there are so few musicals, particularly in the UK, where the LGBTQ characters are black or mixed race or Asian or disabled or deaf or any of those things. And if you go to America, there are shows that are being written with all sorts of different people in mind. I mean, thinking about A Strange Loop, particularly, which is on Broadway at the moment, but also Choir Boy and all sorts of different musicals that have kind of really sort of got to know that there is more to the LGBTQ community than just white gay men, which I think is really important.
Yeah. I saw, and you can read into this what you want, but I saw it was a tweet. It was something like, as a white gay, I think it was specifically men, but as a white gay person, you are white first. Like, that is the identity, or that is the undeniable part of your identity first before you are gay. You can read into that what you will, but I think, you're right in the sense that when it comes to queer stories or queer representation, it's the same as I've experienced it. So I'm not talking from first-hand experience, but with feminism, it's like there is white feminism and there's white queer stories, and that is almost accepted as that is the story. Okay, yep, that's cool. Let's wrap that up. And it's like, whoa, there are other people that
Whoa there.
yeah, there are other people who have stories, who have shared experiences that are not white, and they have just as much to say in whatever the field is.
I think that one of the things that interested me actually, Elander, looking at some of your work, is your spoken word and poetry, and I've seen it. I've seen a little bit of it, and I love it. And I think
thank you.
It's such a direct way to express things, I think. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you got involved in that and where that started for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I just always felt like I wanted to write, but I got a D in English. I didn't do very well academically, and I didn't believe that someone like me could write. I thought that was something that was reserved for only a certain kind of people. That wasn't me, white, rich, straight people. And so it was during lockdown actually. What I lost a job. I was meant to do a play on the West End, and TV job as well. And I kind of was left with nothing. I thought, right, I'm going to try this writing thing. And I just started to kind of write these poems. I think it came from a place of sort of anger, of not having a voice and kind of using them. And I was really into Roald Dahl and Dr. Seuss when I was younger. So that kind of simple poetry that was just a little bit more, it wasn't very complex. And from that kind of characters kind of evolved. So I made the piece called The Ballad of Joe Bloggs, which is a kind of slightly racist football hooligan in a cafe, kind of talking directly to camera, and kind of discovering his racism as it went. And it kind of started from there. So I started to make these kind of films. And I'm making another one in August called The Ballad of Peter Penniless, kind of about the cost of living crisis. And so it's just kind of rolling on. And the great thing about social media, I do think it has its problems, but also you can put something up and it can gain traction. And that's really kind of exciting for, I think, writing specifically and people's voices. So, yeah.
I always think that's quite, that's a very brave thing to do, because it's like one thing being an actor saying words that are written by another person, but then putting your face to your own words.
It's terrifying. Like putting because naturally as artists, we're not really meant to have that direct feedback. You're meant to kind of do something on stage and for a certain amount of time or whatever. On social media, you get instant reaction. You either get people who love it and loads of likes, and sometimes I think I put something on TikTok the other day and it was like 50,000 people saw it and all these amazing comments, which is great. But sometimes you put something up which is of equal quality, but the algorithm doesn't pick it up, or it doesn't, and 1,000 people watch it and 3 people do a thumbs up, and you feel like, oh, my work is awful. So you kind of just have to keep throwing it, and if it sticks, it sticks. If people like it, they like it. If they don't, they don't. And keep churning it out. But social media is I do find it really tricky, because that kind of gratification is not necessarily good for your brain. So you have to kind of take it easy,
Of course.
But that really challenges me as well, actually, that sometimes, and I've watched quite a bit of your work, and I don't think I've liked any of it. And actually I think that's a really important thing that we should remember when we're looking at creators' work and it's direct. And if we've spent the time watching it and we've enjoyed it, and especially if it's changed us, which your work does, I think that there's that is a call to action for me to make sure that I'm lazy with that. So I don't know if I'm lazy or just like quite a private person. I don't really want everyone, because I noticed on Twitter the other day that you can actually click on likes.
Oh, you can see everything.
And you can see everything that I've liked. And I was like, oh, that tells a
Be
story.
Do you know what I've started to do? Sometimes I'm like, oh, I don't know if that can be in public. So I'll also like send it to someone. I have like a history of it. Or you can bookmark it.
I mean, talking about socials, the two, I can't remember the name, the 2 girls that did that Bridgerton, the musical, I think they won a Grammy from it. They use social media. Have you not seen it? No. Oh, it's so wicked. So it's like they watched Bridgerton and decided we're going to write songs for this season, and they turned it into an album. And the songs are so incredible. Brilliant, these 2 girls, and they won a Grammy from that, from putting it on TikTok and creating this whole movement of. So they had people sort of duetting them and singing the duet songs with them, and so the power of social media, specifically talking about musical theatre, is sort of really exciting of how we can kind of reclaim the genre and create new work online, and that kind of. There was like a Ratatouille the musical as well, which is on TikTok, which Lucy Moss was involved with, which kind of just people like writing their own lyrics and writing their own songs and creating something together, which I think is really exciting.
Trevor Buffone who's another academic, has written or is writing a book on TikTok musicals at the moment.
Oh wow!
And so Yeah, one of the things that I love about the things we're talking about here is it's kind of, I don't know about if democratize is the right word, but it's certainly giving access to more people.
Yeah.
So you don't have to be, really rich. You don't have to Daddy doesn't have to have a studio.
Absolutely.
You don't have to have the latest equipment, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And I mean, even thinking about laptops and computers and that kind of thing. I mean, if obviously there's a barrier there to get to that stage where you've got that. But if you've got access to the internet and you've got a computer, you can pretty much
even a phone.
Absolutely. I'm so behind the times. I forgot my telephone can do that as well.
It's really exciting, and for me it's vital to the genre that we move forward and we allow young people to keep creating. I mean, I don't want to slag anyone off, but there are some certain
names,
composers in musical theatre that I do think need to just give it a rest and allow some other people to make some work, because it stops speaking to the majority and starts to speak to a small minority. And I think we need to help people up and allow them to create too. It's really very important.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you're enjoying it, don't forget to subscribe or follow on your favourite podcast service. If you want to follow us on social media, you can follow us on Twitter @QueerMusicals, or you can follow me @Dr. James Lovelock. I've been talking to a lot of actors and creatives recently as part of the research that I'm doing, and these people are so wise and have so many things that should be part of what's happening with theatre and musical theatre and writing and representation and all those things. And it's about trying to find ways to make sure that different people are being heard, and so that things start to change a little bit. Terique and I were talking about this a little bit because we've both just come back from Los Angeles. Whoop, whoop.
Rub it in.
Sorry, Elander.
All right.
But one of the things there is that there is a specific theatre, the East-West Theatre, which specifically puts on plays and musicals for the Asian community. And there's a big Asian community in Los Angeles because there's Chinatown, there's Little Tokyo, there's all sorts of areas there. And there's part of me that thinks that's so brilliant and that's totally important for that community. But also, I want people to go and see that are not necessarily from that community. And it becomes such a difficult. It's the same with when we're thinking about theatres that are specifically doing LGBTQ work, or the wonderful theatres like Grey Eye that are doing work with disability and deafness and that sort of thing. And how do we encourage people? And I say this as somebody that is part of one of these communities. How do we encourage people to go and see things from outside of their community and outside of their experience as well?
That is interesting. And I think that, so with certain places, so like Barbershop or Daddy, that are shows not just, but a lot about blackness, I think we don't want to just be preaching to the choir every single night. We do want to include more black audience members, for example. However, when you have audiences that don't represent it, sometimes it does feel like they're voyeurs. So sometimes it can feel like, oh, that was such a beautiful story, beautiful insight to that life. Okay, I'm going to carry on with my life now. So I think it is an important question. How do we invite people who are new to this story or whatever the piece may be? And how do we invite them in a way that, or how do we get them to leave feeling impacted by it? That is a very interesting question.
I think kind of going back to what you were saying is all about kind of these spaces, like in America, they have that theatre. What we need, I was speaking to Dominic Cook, who directed The Normal Heart, and kind of talking to him about musical theatre and saying, why is it not the same here as it is in America? And he said something quite profound to me, that was, over there, they have experimentational spaces where you're allowed to fail. You're allowed to create something where everyone goes, oh, that didn't really work. Never mind, let's create something else. And we don't have that here. But we do for plays. So the Royal Court, for example, is a place where sometimes you'll go and see something and it'll be like, that was really shit. But that's what the place is about. It's about, this might be awful, this might be great, but it's experimentational and we're allowed to fail. And here, especially musical theatre, is all about the money. It's all about kind of desperately getting money and chopping corners. with no space to fail, no space to create things that might not work but might spur on another idea, and we really need spaces dedicated to that. That's what he said to me, and I kind of was like,
I suppose
yes, we do.
that's why there aren't now as many massive British musicals that even do well in London, let alone across the pond. The one that I'm thinking of that has done that is Six.
Yes.
But I suppose there haven't been many.
So I think Six was because it was comparatively cheap to make, and you've got 6 actors with not really anything else.
Yeah.
You can take it to Edinburgh, you can move it around.
Right.
Big musicals take 9, 10 years sometimes to create, and you have to fail at every single stop to create something new, and there's just not the money.
And there is undoubtedly things out there, or that have been out there, that are out there right now that are just as good, or like credible work that we, I suppose, don't see as much. I'm thinking specifically with musicals as well. I think that's I resonate a lot with that. What Dominic was saying. Yeah,
it's interesting because there have been some musicals that have, I mean, I'm thinking particularly of something like Leave to Remain, which was a musical that was, is it Kelly from Block Party?
I haven't heard of it, actually.
Yeah, but that's the thing, is that we have some of these shows, which that was a queer show about an interracial couple. There's a concept album out of it, but there's not very much else. But actually, I was lucky enough to see that at Lyric Hammersmith. Yeah. And the choreography in it, the direction. And again, you know, there were things about it that you would think, okay, if this went on another stop, then this might be changed or that might be changed. But the problem is that we have these musicals and nobody finds out about them.
Yeah.
Because, you know, and I would say there are places like the Southwark Playhouse, Lyric Hammersmith, the Other Palace, the Soho Theatre, the Hope Mill Theatre up in Manchester.
Yeah, really great.
There's a few theatres that are really trying to do this work, but trying to, I suppose, it's difficult, and I understand this from talking to my students. You know, if you have a limited amount of money, you want to spend the money on something that you know is going to be good.
Of course.
Whereas if you're going to these, and actually I have to be honest, there's been very, very few shows that I've seen, and I've seen lots of shows for this book. There's very few shows that I've seen that I've walked out of going, that was absolutely awful.
That's good.
There's been one or two, but but there hasn't been many. And actually, even the shows that I've thought have been absolutely awful, other people have enjoyed. And it's trying to find a way to encourage people to try out those venues, you know, to try things that are less well known. Because that's how Six started, didn't it? It started up at Edinburgh. Yeah. It could have been an absolute nightmare up there, because for a lot of musicals it is an absolute nightmare. And then it's kind of gone through all of these other stages and things.
I guess in today's climate as well, with people having so little expendable money, that is now kind of, they'd much rather go see something they know is going to be good, and they're going to have a good time because it might be their only show in months, maybe in the year, you know. So it's really difficult to kind of encourage people to do that now. I guess it's harder.
It's definitely up to things, I think, where we have showcases like West End Live, like the Olivier Awards. There's definitely room for those places. And I know that West End Live does this to some extent already. There's definitely room to try and showcase some of these shows. A lot of the shows I've picked up that I've seen have come from little showcase things at the Other Palace in the little studio or whatever it is. But then I'm somebody that is privileged enough to be able to go to those things and find those things and knows where to look.
Yeah.
But it's, I'd love there to be a much more of a range of stuff. I mean, particularly musicals. I'm thinking at the moment there's only one musical that I can think of on the West End that has a LGBTQ character that's anywhere close to being a lead.
Okay. What are you thinking?
I'm thinking of Anne Juliet.
Okay.
Yeah. But I can't think of anything else at the moment.
I mean, that's not great, is it? The industry is saturated by queer people, and yet we're not represented. You know,
There's a great organisation called Representation, which has just started. I don't know if it's an organisation or a little group, but they're putting on concerts at the Phoenix Arts Club every so often, and it's trying to find.
Right.
I know there's a new musical going to Birmingham Rep called To the Street, I think, about the Birmingham bus boycott, which looks really cool, with that Roy Williams is involved with. I also do think it's up to, there's the theatre community and the musical theatre community here are quite split. In America, it's a little bit different. And I think places like the National, the RSC, the Almeida, that are kind of these big establishments that have kind of expendable money to be a bit more experimentational, I think definitely should be looking at creating, because the idea of a musical, it's a play with music. It's, especially here, there's a bit more of a hybrid, and I think there is space to create something new where those two worlds meet, but it takes people to, make a change and take a risk.
I do also think, as you were talking, I was thinking of something I'm guilty of is having a London-centric brain.
Yeah.
We were talking earlier about main character syndrome, and I think I feel like I can say this as a Londoner, but I think Londoners, we suffer from this in that, I always think of theatre in the UK, or I primarily, when I think of theatre in the UK, I think of London, not just West End, but London. Yeah. And that's another thing that's in terms of accessibility. I was lucky. I think of myself as lucky, but lucky enough to grow up in London. So my journey to theatre might have been easier than someone who lived outside of London, because it's so expensive to get here, let alone train in the industry. But that was just a thought that was on my mind as you were talking.
I think that's really true. I mean, even I live in Birmingham, and actually I had heard of To the Streets, but I haven't booked a ticket for it. Yeah, and that's just slapped me into thinking, actually, I do need to look at what is on in Birmingham rather than travelling down to London. I mean, I'm fairly good with knowing what's up in Manchester because I have friends in Manchester, and it's a place I visit quite often. But it is one of those things that we have to kind of train ourselves to change. Definitely. I think. Yeah. Yeah. So I was gonna ask you maybe one more question, which is, and I heard you talking about this while I was fiddling with the machine to try and make it work.
What are we talking about?
but thinking about dream roles for you to play. I mean, I think you were talking specifically about musical theatre, but anywhere really. And what sort of roles would you like to play in the future?
So what we were discussing earlier was. As a man in musical theatre who is not a tenor, I feel like
we are not.
We are not. I personally feel like there aren't many dream roles for me in musicals, and I'm fine with that. That's not my dream, so I'm cool with that. So I don't know. For me, my current goal is to star in an A24 production, film or TV. I'll take either. Because I just think A24, they do very interesting films. Like the most recent one we were talking about was Everything Everywhere All at Once. But that's just one example of their great catalogue of stuff. That is my next goal, I would say.
Excellent.
I mean, similar to Terique, I'm not a tenor, and I spent 3 years singing Old Man River every bloody day when I didn't need to.
That was your entire rep.
Yeah, and then getting out into the industry and kind of being like, I'm going to be leading musicals and going to auditions, and then being so disappointed that I couldn't sing above an F because that was my voice. Musical theatre, I'm not really. I would love to play Snarvin in the Heights, but I'd like that's kind of the only kind of place I can kind of see myself in. But similar to Terique, I don't really have a kind of dream role. I'm really enjoying discovering plays as I go and discovering my kind of place in them. I love the theatre. I kind of want to be on stage forever, but obviously the money is on screen, so that's what I'm focusing on right now. But A24, I'd love to do kind of a Netflix show. I'd love to. I just want to travel and act really and discover characters as I go. I'd love to work with Taika Waititi as well. I think he is such a
he's so fun to work with as well.
Yeah.
One thing Elander said to me the other day, and I was like,
here we go.
Oh my gosh, it's so true. We like being part of pieces that have something to say. And he was like, I think it's not going to be a luxury. Not every single job you work on is going to have something to say that completely echoes something that you want to say to the world. But ultimately, that's what I would like to continue doing, telling stories about people or subjects that are close to my heart.
Yeah, I think because it's our identity too, I struggle not to. Because we are all of these things that we've spoken about. It's difficult not to go into them and talk about queerness or talk about race or talk about these things because it is who I am. So I'm not sure about you, but I'm coming to terms with the fact that if you hire me, these conversations are just going to happen because that's who I am as a person. I think the same with queer people, and be interested to hear your other podcasts when you talk and trans actors, kind of them coming to them and just, I'm going to make this role what it is if you hire me because that's who I am, and I think that's kind of what I want to do. Yeah,
that's amazing. Thank you both so much for
Thanks for
spending some
having us.
time.
Thank you. It's
And
wonderful.
for putting up with all of my technical inefficiencies.
Technical difficulties.
This was serendipitous. We weren't even sitting next to you originally at Legally Blonde, and
Right.
so
We moved down for a better seat next to you, so it was perfect. It was meant to be.
Excellent. I see. If you come and sit next to me at the theatre, who knows what the next step will be.
where life will take you.
Next week on Represent, we're joined by Matthew Coon. Matthew was Billy in Billy Elliot at the Victoria Palace Theatre and is also a dancer and actor and potentially the next James Bond. There's no reason that James Bond could not be Chinese. There we go, perfect. I'm not saying that James Bond would be a particularly strong LGBTQ role. They'd have to do, well,
Not yet.
why not? This episode will come out on Friday the 19th of August. See you there.